Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we've just finished looking at some of the games of Rudolf Spielmann, and we are now looking at the famous Aron Nimzowitsch. So Nimzowitsch, born in 1887, is today very famous for his contribution to chess strategy. His book My System has become a classic, and its impact on chess today is really clearly quite significant. It still resounds as being one of the most classic books you can read, although I know I listened to Perpetual Chess podcast where they discussed it, and I think they thought there were better books that have come out since, but its impact is clearly significant. Now, Reti comments that Nimzowitsch followed Steinhetz's principles and very much tried to improve upon them and tried to develop chess wherever he can. And Reti compares Spielmann to Nimzowitsch, saying that Spielmann was almost against Steinhetz's principle. He was against, not the principles, but he was against those who tried to win positionally. Instead, Spielmann tried to win by combinations and a straight-out attack, whilst Nimzowitsch sought a strategic advantage, where from that strategic advantage, combinations would naturally flow. It's like the saying that tactics are the result of a superior position. Now, Reti comments that Nimzowitsch was the first master to have been given the title hypermodern master. However, Reti thinks that this title, it's almost like all-encompassing, is actually a bit inaccurate for the group of hypermodern masters, because one of the only things that these hypermodern masters had in common was their desire to build upon chess strategy and build upon Steinhetz's principles. How they did it was actually fairly different. Now, Reti also comments that Nimzowitsch very often challenged a lot of the ideas of Tarrasch, and I believe in his book My System he has quite a few short essays and things challenging Tarrasch's ideas. And Reti comments that one key example of this is how Nimzowitsch felt that Tarrasch overestimated the importance of pawns in the center of the opening. Instead, Nimzowitsch showed that you can try and control the center with your pieces rather than your pawns. And that Tarrasch also overestimated the advantage you have when you are restricting your opponent. Now, some of Nimzowitsch's contributions have been proven to be quite strong. Now, the Nimzo-Indian is sort of started from Nimzowitsch, although it was developed quite a significantly since then, but that's one of the best defenses against the Queen's Gambit. Yet other Nimzowitsch openings are perhaps not so good. However, in this game, we see almost what Reti's talking about. Now, this game, Nimzowitsch has the white pieces, and his opponent, Georg Salwe, has the black pieces. And it starts off with a French defense, and Nimzowitsch plays the advanced French. Reti calls this the Paulson variation, but I think you need a few more moves to get into the Paulson variation, although I might be wrong there. So I think, first of all, Reti comments that in this position, the whole idea is that black is restricted. So black's restricted in space, primarily because of this e5 pawn limiting the amount of space that black has. It's this e6 pawn and e5 pawn are very much restricting black's position. However, Reti comments that it's been quite difficult for white to be able to hold this. Black's usually able to free themselves eventually with something like c5 and f6, and white would struggle to keep this restriction in place. However, Reti commented that Nimzowitsch saw that white is less concerned with defending these pawns. White less concerned with keeping pawns on d4 and e4, and is instead more concerned with keeping control of the squares d4 and e5. He's not concerned whether there are pawns on those squares, he's concerned about whether he has control over those squares. If his pieces are controlling e5, then black will be unable to advance the pawn, and therefore black will be still restricted. And that was the main aim of it. And because of that, Reti commented that Nimzowitsch had no real issue exchanging off this d pawn for this c pawn after the c5 break. He had no issue exchanging it off. After the f6 break, he had no issue exchanging it off or accepting the exchange. And instead, he tried to make it so these d4 and e5 squares were strong points for white, and therefore weak points for black. Now in the game, we see c5 and c3, just what you'd expect normally in the French defense. Now, Reti does comment that Nimzowitsch had tried something like bishop f4 before, because after c takes d4, bishop d3, and he comments that the idea is that white will overprotect this e5 pawn. And yes, black has taken this d4 pawn and his upper pawn, but this d4 pawn combined with this d5 pawn are actually sort of limiting black. Black's not really got many options to try and free up their position. They're never going to be able to push these pawns. They've got quite a bit less space, and they haven't got any more c pawns to try and push down and break. Now, the computer doesn't particularly like this variation, and I've not been able to find any of Nimzowitsch's games in this, so I suspect that it was probably dismissed quite quickly. But it's sort of, I wanted to include it because it sort of is quite illustrative of Nimzowitsch's ideas. And actually, Reti does comment that if black tries to hold on to this pawn with moves like bishop to c5, then this pawn is just going to be obstructing all of black's pieces, and white's going to have a lot more activity, and whilst black's going to be quite paralyzed. So it's an interesting idea, although given we haven't seen it, it's clearly, and the computer doesn't particularly like it, it's clearly not that sound, but it is illustrative of black's ideas. Sorry, of Nimzowitsch's ideas. But we see c3 instead. We then see knight to c6, and the French defense in French is very typical to pile up on this d4 pawn to try and allow this breakthrough to gain space, and to try and get an f6 breakthrough to gain space and almost free up your position. That's a very common theme in the French defense. So white naturally responds, knight f3, defending the pawn. Queen to b6, attacking. And now bishop to d3. Nimzowitsch also annotated this game very briefly, not enough to really have that many comments on. But in his notes, he commented that bishop e2 may be better since it's directly defending the d4 pawn. Now it's not. The d4 pawn is still defended. It's a common trap that after these exchanges, you have this check, and you win the queen. So bishop d3 does still tactically defend the d4 pawn. However, Nimzowitsch said that he felt bishop e2 was perhaps a bit more accurate because it more directly defends the d4 pawn. But we have bishop to d3, and now bishop to d7. So now black is threatening to take this pawn, because at the end of all of the exchanges, there's no check, because you would just hang your bishop. Although they may be able to take here first, but black wouldn't be able to win the pawn. So he plays bishop to d3 and now bishop to d7. However, this is a bit of an inaccuracy because with bishop g7, black is now threatening to take this d4 pawn. However, white also now has a chance to take on c5 and therefore control the c3 square, sorry, the d4 square with his c3 pawn, and try and control the d4 square with his pieces. And so that's what he does. He takes on c5. Instead, black probably should have taken on d4 first, and then played bishop d7, creating this threat on d4. Because with how the game went, white's going to quite easily be able to control this d4 square with his pieces and this pawn. And that's going to be quite a key theme for this entire game. Now we see bishop takes c5. Well, we can see that black's getting his development done quite quickly. But castles are now f6. And this is a very common theme with the French defense. You see moves like f6 all of the time, just trying to break open the center, trying to take away white's central pawns. Just like you see c5 trying to take away white's central pawns. And interestingly, Nimzowicz's note here says that black swells in triumph and throws himself hungrily on the last remaining member of the once so proud pawn chain family to destroy him. His war cry is room for the e-pawn, but it happens quite otherwise. And we'll see just how it happens quite otherwise. There's going to be a theme throughout the game. Now Reti comments that what may have been better is something like a5, preventing b4 from coming, and also potentially controlling this b5 square. So after something like knight a3, you can try and get to here, support it with a4. There's different options. But instead we see f6, and now b4. So Nimzowitsch wants to defend the e5 pawn. He wants to play bishop f4, but this would just hang the b2 pawn. So instead he plays b4, forcing the bishop to retreat. And now he can play bishop f4. Now Nimzowicz's notes, he does comment that something else like queen e2 may defend the e5 pawn. However, after f takes e4, knight takes, queen takes, and knight out, the queen on e5 is going to be driven away quite easily with just something like bishop b6 even. And black's going to struggle, white might struggle to control these two squares. So he doesn't particularly like that variation, so instead he plays b4, forcing the bishop back. It can go to e7 or f8, and e7 is the only logical move, therefore. And now bishop f4, defending this e5 square with his pieces. F takes e5, knight takes e5. And now knight takes e5 and bishop takes e5. So white's d and e pawns have disappeared, which would normally make a French defense player very happy. They would often think that they've succeeded in their opening. They have the two central pawns and are able to advance these to gain full central control and therefore actually restrict white. Except, like Nimzowitsch said, it's quite the otherwise. Because white is the one who's in full control of these d4 and e5 squares, which means that black's position is going to continue to be restricted because they're never going to be able to push these pawns and free up their position. And primarily the e5 square is of most importance because that's the one that's holding this e6 pawn on e6, and therefore this e5 square is the one that's limiting black's position more than anything. So Nimzowitsch is now going to try and focus on controlling these squares even more. So we see knight f6, knight to d2, castles, and knight f3, adding another defender to these two squares. You see bishop to d6, queen to e2, adding another defender. Rook a to c8, logical move, trying to control the open file, attacking black's weak pawn, and also there is this weak square here. We see bishop to d4, queen to c7, and now knight to e5. So Nimzowitsch, after this move, he probably wanted to try and keep control of, he wanted to keep the bishop pair first of all, and he wanted his knight on the outpost, and also if there are any exchanges, he would rather black exchange his bishop for this knight than give up his bishop pair, because this bishop is doing quite a strong, it has quite a strong role on this diagonal. This bishop's very strong, and this bishop is also defending this c3 pawn. So he drops back, declining any exchanges. We then see queen e7, knight to e5, bishop to e8. Now we see rook a to e1. See how he's just piling up on this e5 square? And now bishop takes e5. And Reti comments that it's quite natural that black wants to exchange. Black has less space, so naturally black wants to try and exchange some pieces off, so he has more space for the pieces. However, this bishop is black's better bishop. If you can look at this bishop and this knight and this bishop's probably one of black's better minor pieces. And yet here he's exchanging it off, which Reti says just renders his position worse. Now we have queen to c6. The queen was attacked. Bishop back to d4. Bishop to d7. Queen to c2. And you see the power of these bishops now. And actually this is something which I noticed when I was playing through this game, but isn't really commented on. If there were pawns on d4 and e5, then this bishop couldn't be here. This bishop would not have the option of controlling this diagonal. Now, in some positions it may be that this diagonal is better for the bishop to control. But I think it's something that's quite telling for me is that this bishop has the option of controlling this diagonal or controlling this diagonal. And maybe if they can somehow defend this pawn, maybe even can have some pressure on this diagonal. Although that's a bit more far-fetched because black can just play b6. But it's a bit more interesting. Instead of having the pawns on d4 and e5, having a piece there gives that piece extra scope. However, equally, if the bishop were to move, then it may be a bit more awkward to defend this e5 square, so the bishop is also sort of stuck on this diagonal. Now here we see rook to f7, and now we see we see rook to e3. We see b6, and now rook to g3. And now we see a common theme that we've seen over and over again. Black is restricted in the middle. So white, they don't have any pawns in the center, but it's pretty clear that white has the central control. White has the space advantage, even without the pawns in the center. So white controls the center, they have the space advantage, and their pieces are all coordinated. And they're coordinated because they have the center and the space advantage. So as usual, when your opponent is a bit less, is uncoordinated and don't really have much space to get their pieces coordinated, then you should be looking at attacking on the wings. You've done what you want in the center, so now you're going to attack in the wings. So we see rook to g3. Now, Reti actually comments that he thinks that g6 is the only move that would prevent a loss of material, but it is clearly very weakening. However, the computer finds a nice little combination. Bishop takes g6. And now the computer actually just wants e5, after which you can just take on f7, and then take on e5, and you just up 4 points of material. But if you were to take on h takes g6, then queen takes here would come. Now, king f8 is the best move. King f8 is mate in 5. King h8, you'll just be walking into rook h3, because after rook to h7, you just take, because the knight is pinned, so it no longer defends this square. So king f8 is obviously rook g7 just runs into mate in 1. So king f8 is therefore the only real option, but that leads to a mate in 5 after bishop takes f6, and you can't take f6 because you would just walk into a mate in 2. King e8 and rook g8 is mate. So the line which a computer gives is king to e8, going on a little bit of a queen run. Except now queen h5 is coming. Note the rook is now pinned, and rook to g8 is now threatened. If king g8, then queen h8. So the only way to defend rook g8 is one of two options. You could play queen d6, or the line which I like is queen to c5. And the idea is after rook to g8, queen to here, and then rook takes, king takes, queen f8. Sorry, queen h8. So I quite like queen c5 for that, but queen d6 does the same thing. So that's what will come after g6. Reti didn't see it. I'm not too sure if Nimzowitsch saw it though, but he certainly would have seen that at the very least it's a very weakening move, and he's going to be able to get a very nice attack against black because of this weakness. I note that it actually creates dark square weaknesses, so it's another reason for white to have not exchanged this dark square bishop, and another reason for black to have not exchanged their dark square bishop. So we don't see g6, what we actually see is king to h8. However, after bishop takes h7, this just decides the game. So knight takes h7 is lost because of queen to g6. And now there's quite a few threats. Let's say you just play rook to g8. Well, then rook h3 is coming, and how do you stop mate? You can't. Let's say you try and push e5, which is sort of what happens in the game, but then you hang the rook, and you still can't take here because of mate. So queen f6 is the computer's move, but even then just queen takes d7, and you're now threatening to take the rook, and this is just dead lost. So we saw bishop takes h7, and if knight takes, you'd have queen g6. So we don't see knight takes. Instead, we see e5, which is the computer's move, counter-attacking the bishop, counter-attacking in the centre. So it's quite a principled move. When your opponent is attacking on the flanks, you counter-attack in the centre. A very principled move. Now, Nimzowitsch plays bishop to g6, counter-attacking the bishop, counter-attacking the rook. We see rook to e7, and now rook to e1, developing the rook and also pinning this pawn. We see queen to d6, defending the rook and renewing the threat of pawn takes d4. So bishop to e3 is played. And now we see d4. So black has managed to finally push these pawns, except it's just too late. You see bishop to g5. Nimzowitsch is ahead of pawn, and he's about to be going into a very easily winning position. And now we see rook takes c3. Hoping to try and get some exchanges, I think, just to try and ease the position a bit. But after rook takes c3, d takes c3, queen takes c3, king to g8, Nimzowitsch plays a3 to keep these pawns defended and also keep them on the opposite colour square as this bishop. We see king f8, bishop h4, so threatening bishop to g3 to try and win this pawn. Black plays bishop e8, attacking this bishop. We see bishop to f5, queen to d4, offering a queen trade, but after queen takes, pawn takes, rook takes, king takes, bishop to d3, white now got a winning ending. And I suspect that Nimzowitsch had quite a few different ways he could have won earlier on, but this is probably the more simple way to win. We see king to d6, and bishop takes here, g takes, king f1, bishop to c6, bishop to c6, and h4. And here black resigned. And this is what I mean by this is one of the more simple ways that white's able to win. White's quite easily able to transform these 3 pawns into 2 protective pass pawns. This bishop is blockading this pawn. The king's ready to come up. Well, perhaps not to there, but the king's ready to come up. Even after something like these, he's able to come up. He's got a lot of options here. And so this is quite easily won for Nimzowitsch. And because of that, black resigned in this position. And so that's game at number 43, the first of Nimzowicz's games that we're going to look at. And let's get to a iconic position. So this is probably the most iconic position, perhaps after the exchange. How white is controlling all of the squares with his pieces. White is restricting black with his pieces rather than with pawns. In the past, we've always seen it with pawns. However, now we're seeing it with the pieces. So it's quite a newer concept, but it sort of builds upon the ideas of weak squares and controlling weak squares, and combining that idea with controlling the center and restricting your opponent, and then using that positional advantage to attack on the wings. So everything keeps coming together more and more. But I quite like this game. It's a nice variation of the French. Clearly black made a few mistakes which allowed this position, but it was still quite an instructive game. But yeah, that's game number 43. So if you like this video, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.